Hello, it's Uncle Jeff again on March 8th, 2022 with Psychic Stuff Part 2. Just a little follow-up from the last video about my island. I drew the map of Macmandu and then Plato's description of Atlantis. I left out a couple of things, that the location of my island was in the central North Atlantic, right on the ridge where the continent of Atlantis supposedly was. The Azores and the Canary Islands, there's supposedly bits of it left over. But my island was 200 by maybe 150 miles, so it looked, like this. And Plato's continent then was located in the same area, but he also described mountains in the north. As I described, there were mountains in the north in Macmandu with fjords, like I have here. And then this is the Florida part with the little islands. And Plato's map looked like this. And it was narrower, but there were mountains in the north. And as I said, they put south at the top and north at the bottom. So if you turn it around, you see, even though it's a much larger, it's actually a continent the size of South America, so way much bigger than mine. And mine looked like that. So you see they're very similar. And I think I probably made mine square like that so it fit the 3 by 3 foot tag board I was using. So I think I was drawing a map of Atlantis and probably lived there like many of us did. Even though it sounds weird, right? So now I'm to 1978. I'm at my first job at South Medical Clinic. I'd just been there probably 4 months. I was on call. We were still living in the condo, hadn't moved into our house yet, which would happen at Christmas. And I remember standing in the kitchen talking on the wall phone to a patient of the senior doctor's, Dr. Kelly. He had done a hernia repair on this man some years before. And I'm talking to him about 6:30 in the morning. He's having horrible pain down in his right groin where the hernia repair was, and he needed to see Dr. Kelly. I said, well, he'll be at the hospital in a half hour, so can you have somebody bring you down there if you can't drive, and I'll let him know you're there. So Dr. Kelly saw him in the ER. We met in the doctor's lounge before we went to the office, and I said, what do you think of that? And he said, well, that's sort of strange pain for hernia. So I admitted him. I'm going to have Dave Culligan, the surgeon, look at him. And at the time, I had thought back to when I was talking to him on the phone. On the phone, I got a very clear message in my head that this man was having a dissecting aneurysm, where blood goes down the different layers of the blood vessel. And when it stretches the outer layer, that hurts. And that was another reason why I made him come in with another driver. And I said to Dr. Kelly, what do you think? Maybe he has a dissecting aneurysm going down his iliac artery. And he goes, oh, you young guys, just think of all these impossible things, I said, okay. So we go to the office, and Dr. Culligan, I guess, sees him in the morning, and he's also kind of baffled by the pain. Back in these days, there was no MRIs or CAT scans. We just had ultrasound, and I don't know if he ordered one or not. But about 1 o'clock, we got a call from the hospital that the man had coded. And Dr. Kelly said, he looked at the schedule. I said, you only have a couple patients this afternoon. I'll take care of them. Why don't you go down? And I said, yeah, I bet the aneurysm ruptured, being kind of the smart young doctor I was. And I get there, and they're still working on him, and they're, pumping fluids into him. They don't see any place he's bleeding from. And I said, well, I think he's got an aneurysm, and he's bleeding internally. And then finally got to the point where shocking didn't bring him back, and he was obviously low on volume, and the poor man died. He was in his late 70s. And when they did the autopsy, indeed, he had an aneurysm dissecting down his iliac artery past his groin into his leg. And I was right. I had one other psychic diagnosis. I'll skip ahead. This was 1989 in Phoenix when I worked for Cigna. One of my elderly ladies came in for her annual exam, wasn't feeling too well, and we got to the end of the exam, did the pap smear, and she was kind of chubby, so it was a little difficult to do. And while I was doing the pelvic exam, I didn't feel anything abnormal, but in my mind, I saw lymphoma in her lymph nodes, all from her pelvis and going up her spine, up next to the aorta. And this really bothered me, and I thought, well, the last time I had a feeling like this, I was right. So I said, let's, we had CAT scans by then. So I said, let's get a scan of your pelvis and just see what's going on. So she was, she was very nervous about everything, but she felt good that I was doing the workup. So I put on the request slip, rule out lymphoma of pelvis and abdomen. The radiologist called me and said, what gives you this impression? So I had to kind of fudge it a bit. And I said, well, I was doing her pelvic exam. I think I felt some masses, and they were in the midline, they weren't over either ovary. So a couple of days later, he had done the exam. He called me right from having done it, and he said, well, you're right. You're sort of right. He said, she's got ovarian cancer in her left ovary, and it's metastasized all up and down her peritoneal, retroperitoneal lymph nodes, the ones that go up in front of the spine. And so I knew this wasn't a very good diagnosis for a lady in her 80s. I called her up, and, oh, doctor, she'd been so nervous about this. And I said, well, I'm, sorry to have to tell you, you have cancer in your left ovary, and it's gotten into some of the lymph nodes, but I'm going to send you to our oncologist. He's a really nice guy, and he'll outline a plan of treatment for you. He said, oh, well, thank you very much. And she didn't sound nervous anymore. And she said, well, I'll look forward to seeing Dr. Gene, we called him, and thank you, for letting me know. And now, now I can rest assured things will be taken care of. And so, okay. So that was on a Friday. On Monday, I get to the office, and there's a note that my patient had died on Sunday. And her husband became so anxious because I had told her the news of her diagnosis. She hadn't gotten upset, but she passed away from it. So he thought I'd scared her to death. And even though he liked me as a doctor, he said, I just can't come back to you because my wife died after you told her what she had. But I was right. That's what she had. So now we move ahead to 1983, our first time Randy and I came to Saba. We finally had enough money where we could take a winter vacation away from Minnesota, and Randy wanted to go to beaches with, with nice white sand beaches and swimming, and I wanted to come to Saba because I'd been reading about it ever since I was 10 years old, and I was just very curious, and he wasn't all that interested in it. So we came to Saba, St. Martin, and we went to Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands to satisfy his need for white sand beaches. We landed on Saba and the little short runway, supposedly the most dangerous landing in the world. However, I've now done it like 64 times, landing and taking off, so it's not much anymore. But it was a little scary the first time, I must admit, kind of like landing on an aircraft carrier. But I immediately felt at home as we walked out. I thought, oh, this feels like home, just like when I drive home to Olivia. That's kind of odd. So the taxi driver takes us up the first 13 or 14 switchbacks till we get to the first village way high called Hell's Gate. And once we've hit the crest and we're starting down out of Hell's Gate, it goes down and turns to the right around the corner. And I said, watch out. I said, there's a big rock hanging out over the road. Don't hit it. And the taxi driver turns around and looks at me and he says, have you been here before? And I said, no, but I just know there's a rock around the corner. And indeed, as we came around the corner, there was a huge boulder that hung out over about a third of the road, and you actually went under part of it. And years later, when they got excavators and some tall equipment on the island, they actually had to jackhammer part of that rock out so that they could fit under it. So I knew that was there from somewhere. Later on, I think one of the psychics told me they thought I'd been a shaman here in the 700, the 800s. That's when the Arawak Indians lived on the island. So, I guess I could believe that. In 1987, we had a timeshare in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, that held 4 people. And we wanted to take our friends Jack and Rob from San Diego down with us. Rob had hit on hard financial times. His investments had gone bad at that time when the stock market had gone down. He wasn't making much money. He had to go to the San Diego Zoo and work in the security department. And Jack didn't have a lot of money to live on, but he could afford his plane ticket, and of course the hot lodging would be free. So we bought Rob a ticket and we went down to Cabo for a week. And Jack brought along a duffel bag with a bunch of metaphysical and New Age books in it that he wanted to read. And he said, he encouraged me. I wasn't at first going to do any reading on the vacation. I was going to lie in the sun and bake like Randy did. He said, "Now, why don't you, look at some of these books? They're kind of interesting." And they were on, reincarnation, Eastern religions and philosophy, channeling, mediums, talking about the other side, the astral plane, or what's referred to in the Bible as heaven. And I read every book he had, and of course he did too, and I just was enthralled by it, and I just was, hungering for more. So I got back to Phoenix, and I found a New Age bookstore to buy books in. And then when I went to San Diego for medical conferences, we always stayed with Rob, and then Jack would come over, and he introduced me to the controversial bookstore, which was in Normal Heights. That was a section of town Jack lived in. Rob lived in the neighboring gay section called Hillcrest. And Jack said, "Well, I live in abnormal heights because there's gay people over here too." I had a cute way to say things. And so I got books from Jane Roberts channeling Seth, and J.Z. Knight channeling Ramtha, and Ruth Montgomery, and even Shirley MacLaine had written some, and one by Dr. Brian Weiss, who was a psychiatrist who used hypnotherapy to help people get over anxieties. And he accidentally stumbled onto someone who actually went into a past life, and he didn't even realize it until she started talking about her surroundings. And now he is a world-renowned teacher of regression therapy, and he's in his 70s, probably about my age. So when we'd stay with Rob, we used to play Scrabble with Jack coming over at the dining room table, and they had a friend who had died about a year before named Ted that they always played Scrabble with. And Ted used to joke, and he'd say, "Well, don't cheat at Scrabble, because when I die, I'm going to come back and haunt you if you do." And then as it turned out, Ted got cancer and died fairly quickly within about 6 months. So we'd be playing Scrabble, and the chandelier would turn off, and Rob would go fiddle with the switch, and then it would come back on. And he said, "Well, there must be a short in the switch or a short in the lamp," but it never went bzzz or anything. It just shut off. And so other times it would occasionally do it on different trips. And then finally we noticed it only did it when we played Scrabble. It never did it any other time, or when we were eating, or, it's just when we played Scrabble. So we started saying, well, it must be Ted turning the lamp off. And then if we'd address him, and when he'd shut it off, we'd say, "Ted, turn the light back on." Within probably less than 30 seconds, it would come back on by itself. So I guess that was Ted in the light. And I had that kind of experience later with Randy. In 1988, when about the time we got back from that trip to Cabo San Lucas, we had moved to a new office across the street, and we had a new lab tech, a very large Lithuanian woman, 6 feet tall, probably over 300 pounds, named Gail, real sweetie. And she had an underbite, so she looked kind of like a bulldog. Very imposing woman. Anyway, one day she came to me, it was a Tuesday, I remember, and she said, "Dr. Vadnam, I don't know you very well. Is your mother alive?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I get the feeling that she's got something wrong with her left side. Is she okay?" And I said, "Well, I haven't talked to her lately. She's in La Jolla, California with Mike, her husband. They go there in the summer. And, I haven't talked to him for a week or two." So that night I called her up and said, "How you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I didn't want to call you and worry you, but this weekend I slipped in the tub and I hit my left hip, and I was having a hard time walking, and Mike insisted that I go to the ER, and I had x-rays, and it wasn't broken, and they gave me a cane, and I'm getting around okay, but I got kind of a bruise." And I said, "Well, the lab tech at the office told me your left side was hurting, so I thought I'd better call." And then there was a little silence on the phone, and when people hear something they don't understand, and well, okay, well, let's talk about something else. She didn't want to talk about that. So then shortly after that, I met my really good medium friend, Kay Randall May, whom I mentioned in the last vlog. She came in as a patient on my panel on a Thursday or a Friday. First time I saw her, she had bronchitis, and she said, "Doctor, are you open to me sharing something with you?" And I said, "Oh, sure, go ahead." She said, I had an argument with my ex-husband over our son who has behavior problems. And when I have a real big argument with him, she said, it always ends up in pneumonia because I take it into my heart area and it infects my lungs. So some of this sounded familiar from what I'd read, but it wasn't a very popular way of making a diagnosis in 1988. She said, I know this is going to turn into pneumonia over the weekend. I don't want to go into urgent care. Would you mind giving me a prescription for erythromycin? And I'll start taking it when I can tell it's getting worse. And if it doesn't get worse, I won't take it. And I'll come in next week and get an x-ray. So I gave it to her, and on Tuesday she was back in my schedule. And I saw my nurse putting her in, and I said, did you get the pneumonia? And she said, oh, yeah. So I had Gail take the x-ray before I even saw her, and the left lung was totally whited out with pneumonia, so she predicted it. And then later we got together and did a lot of other things, so that'll come later on. By 1989, I was reading a lot of metaphysical books that I've gotten in San Diego and also in Phoenix, and mostly written by American authors or British authors. And I was thinking, I should really start reading one, written by an Indian or a guru, because I know a lot of this thought comes from there, and there's a lot of Indian writers that I could explore. And then that created the most lucid dream I have ever had in my life that made a huge change in my life. And that will be the beginning of the next vlog. So stay tuned.